Welcome everyone to the Dafa discussion panel. You know, how many of you have come on today to listen to what really are the insights of this incredibly beautiful practice? And of course, for all of you listening, what we've wanted to achieve each time is just giving you a heart's value of what goes on in Falun Gong. You know, we've got a massive practice that millions upon millions around the world are benefiting from. And it is a massive spiritual practice. So that alone, with the way we are in our world, naturally, you know, can put some of us on edge. Even sometimes the word spiritual, I was never even seeking spirituality when I started practicing. So what Loui and I are going to do today is just talk frankly about how we came in contact with this Falun Gong and the immediate things that impacted each of us that let us understand that this is actually something we can do. This is definitely something that we want to do. So, Loui, hello, my friend, as usual.
Hey, Mike.
So let me kick it off with the first question. How did you, and what were the circumstances of you coming into contact with Falun Gong?
Yeah, so I just first moved to Queensland in 2020, and it was during the first kind of initial stages of COVID. So we were locked down. I just moved, so I didn't have a job at the time. And I was part of this spiritual forum on the internet for a number of years. I've always been like dabbling in spiritual ideas, but never really settled on anything. And somebody on there was sharing their heartfelt experience about obtaining the Fa and reading through Zhuan Falun and doing the exercises and
that's all Falun Gong. For anyone who doesn't know, Zhuan Falun's the main teacher of Falun Gong.
Yes.
That's like a traditional practitioner. I think everyone knows it.
Yes. So Zhuan Falun is the main book of Falun Gong or Falun Dafa. And so they was explaining how they've benefited. So the curious person I am, I downloaded the book off the main website, falundafa.org, and I read it through in a short amount of time because I had lots of free time at the time.
Being jobless.
Yeah, jobless, locked down during COVID. So the first time I read Zhuan Falun, it was a bit of a blur, but it had like a very deep impact on the way I was thinking. And yeah, it like felt like I was like being cleaned up and my mind was like being cleaned up.
Loui, that's something that people can't understand. It's not, of course I have to. And anyone listening, unless you've experienced something so beautiful like that, Loui, try to describe it more so that people can understand.
Yeah. So in the past, I've suffered from a lot of like mental illness, mostly depression and that kind of thing.
You look definitely not like you suffer from that. Holy moly. I can't believe you even said that. That's incredible.
So I was deeply depressed for like over 10 years and contemplated suicide a lot. Before obtaining the Fa, I wasn't that bad, but I was still like a little bit. And so as I was reading the Fa, the Fa is short for law in Chinese. So Falun Dafa, I think roughly translates to law wheel.
Great
law. Yes. I think a lot of my negative like thinking habits were kind of changing as I was reading.
And you could feel it.
Yeah, I could feel it. And I kind of left after reading the book for the first time feeling lighter in my mind, not thinking so harshly towards myself, and with a more kind of positive feeling about how I can grow now, knowing what I do from reading Zhuan Falun.
From one read.
Yeah. And I wanted to read it again because I didn't feel like I understood enough of the content. Yeah.
That is amazing. I mean, for me, just, this subject, it's interesting because I first came into contact with Dafa through Stephen Menner. You know Stephen Christie. Everyone, Loui and I are both in Queensland. We're both Aussies, as you can tell from our your speech. But and we both know Steve, who at the time when both my best friend and I came in contact with Dafa, we were in Queensland, actually in Brisbane, where Loui is, and Steve worked in Australian movies, and he came back from set and said, "Man, have you ever heard of Falun Dafa?" At the time, I was like, "That is the strangest thing I've ever heard you say." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Oh, it's like a Buddhist cultivation way." He said, "I'm not quite sure what it's about yet, but I met a guy on set, a stylist, Gabriel. His name's Gabriel, and he told me about the practice and gave me a flyer about it. He was so, like Steve was telling me, the guy was so loving it that he had a flyer there in his bag. And Steve said, "I'm going to go and do these exercises." He said, "There's these 5 exercises Gabriel was telling me about." Now, the thing with Steve, the difference with Steve is that Steve, like I guess quite a few people around the world, and maybe some of you watching right now, had quite open third eye. And so he grew up actually seeing all kinds of things throughout his life, some things very beautiful, some things very scary. And he always knew that that was part of him. I guess many people who have that sort of thing, they see it as a bit of a gift. But Steve never took it seriously. He only saw things when he saw things. So anyway, he said to me, "I get a really strong feeling this thing's good, really good. I'm going to go and do the exercises this weekend." Now, I was a personal trainer at the time, so my whole world was external. If it wasn't about muscle and kickboxing, I really didn't want to listen about it. And so Steve went and did the exercises, and I'll never forget when he came back, I said to him, "Well, how'd you go?" And his words were, "I really still don't know what this thing is, but it's really good. It's really good." He said, "I've never felt anything like those exercises." And that was quite amazing because I respected Steve's words on many levels. He was also an outstanding and is an outstanding person. And so I went and did them the next weekend. And there were 2 things that were quite incredible. One is when I started to do exercise 1 and then ventured into exercise 2, and I'm standing there, with my arms like this, a very, very strong feeling came into my mind that what I'm experiencing in this clarity, this clear mind, it's not just relaxation. It's just so far beyond it. The real thought in my mind was, this is not something, how would I put it? This is not something that's a general meditation. Like you go there, you sit cross-legged and everyone sort of goes, and that's about it. There was something so profound about the way it was affecting my heart, my mind, and my general feeling of clarity. It was beautiful. And then after I finished exercise 5, and I say this on all of the exercise webinars that I take part in, I stood up, and the first thing that came to my mind was looking down at my feet, because I honestly wasn't quite sure whether my feet were on the ground. And it sounds ridiculous and it sounds a bit over the top, but that was my actual thought. I felt so light after exercise 5, my feet, I just couldn't feel the contact like normal. It was a very unusual experience. And then Gabriel became a friend of ours, or initially a friend of Steve's, because they were talking on the movie set at Dreamworld. And then Steve invited Gabriel to come out with Steve and I and our girlfriends and our friends, and Gabe came and sat with us. And Gabe turned to me and said, "Mike, what did you think of Falun Dafa?" And I said, "Oh, it's wonderful. The exercises, I've never felt anything like it." And he looked at me and he said, "No, Falun Dafa, Zhuan Falun, the teaching." And I said, "What's Zhuan Falun?" And he rolled his eyes at me like this. He went, and just shook his head. He's Greek, of course. All the Greeks do that. And he squatted down and he pulled out of his knapsack that he took everywhere with him, his own book, Zhuan Falun, and he passed it across the table to me. And it was so natural and instinctive for me to take this book. But actually, I wasn't a reader. I never read a thing. All I did was read muscle magazines. I never read anything. I just looked at magazine and pictures and looked at and just had a quick read about how to make my calves a bit bigger because they seemed a bit outbalanced with my quads. So I took the book, and like Loui over there, I got home, I opened it, and we must have gotten home about 8:30, and it was 12 o'clock before I stopped reading. And every single page, all it said to me was, this guy is actually the real deal. And he's talking about enormous things in the world of human life and existence, not only human life, but the world of the universe and all of these spiritual aspects that we've been hearing about naturally our whole lives in great detail. And there were such large insights that by the time I'd finished, maybe because I'm actually a very slow reader, by the time I'd finished 15 pages, like Loui said, I honestly felt that it had changed my perspective on how I saw myself as a person and who I wanted to be as a person. And it changed my perspective on how I wanted to lead my life, what I want to do with my life, this precious life that we've got. So anyway, that was my first interaction, like Loui. Now, Loui, what were the changes that it made in your family as far as how you were a man in your family? How did it change that?
Yeah. So
bit of a big question, I know. Everyone is itching to hear it. So.
Yeah, in the past, my relationship with my family hasn't always been like super close. I think, like among my brother and Mike's, there was like some issues because of, like childhood bullying from me to him not being a very good big brother, which left some scars. And in my extended family, particularly my grandma, like she's not my blood grandma, but she's kind of like my father's stepmom. So I didn't feel too close to her. But after practicing Falun Dafa, I feel like all those connections have got a lot closer, and there's no animosity or I had a lot of like bad kind of views about my grandmother because comes from a different generation, and I couldn't quite understand her her kind of lifestyle. But after like practicing Falun Dafa, I had a very big shift in the way I view the world, and completely like changed how I view my grandmother, and yeah, so we're quite close now, and yeah, all my relationships in my family have improved. I'm still not perfect, like I need to.
Who is?
Yeah. But yeah, it's quite amazing actually.
And did they notice that? Did they notice the change in you?
Yeah, particularly my grandmother, because I hadn't really, spoken to her very much or made a big effort to get to know her and be a good grandson. But yeah, my friendship with my brothers deepened a lot as well. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. It's crazy. Well, sorry, keep going. What were you going to say?
I was just asking you how did it change you?
Oh my goodness. Like, where do I begin? Just very quickly, what I said before about, I started bodybuilding when I was 14. And I guess in a way, I always considered myself a fairly decent person, never bullied anyone. And I was always very happy, a happy person. But I'd become very, very narrow-minded, I guess you could say. And my whole world existed just around the physical, By the time I, like Loui had mentioned, attained the Fa, because it's such a huge, beautiful thing, it's got to have some kind of quite amazing thing to say about it, attaining the Fa. And that's just when we really feel like we got it. We understood what was in Zhuan Falun, and we started to decide to practice being a practitioner, raising our morals and, following that guidance. So by the time I attained the Fa, I'd spent from the age of 14 to 34, I think, in bodybuilding and kickboxing. And I'd lived in a few countries around the world, and I'd spent over a decade as a personal trainer by that time. And so it was a massive change for me. I went from my temple was a gym. My temples were actually my favorite gyms around Brisbane. I would sit in them and be in awe of the temple. And a little bit like Arnie used to say back in the 70s. And so you can imagine my world was purely physical. But after reading, I hadn't even finished reading it. Like I said, I'm a very slow reader. And even after, not even halfway, I just had this awakening in my heart that there's so much more to Michael Anderson. There's so much more to this person that I can give to the world, give to my mother, my poor mother. I moved out of home when I was 14 because I was desperate to get out into the world. Yes. And my mother and I got on fabulously, but anyway, the pursuit of the world's things, And so for a start, because I'd gone to a real extreme with physical fitness and physicality, I was at the point where my only outlet any more physical was skydiving. I'd already done that. My only other outlets were going to Scotland and going in these crazy cross-country things, where you bike ride down a mountain cliff and then you go across a gorge on a wire and then let go and fall into the gorge and swim through the tunnels. And oh my gosh, And so I really realized, I guess, that was really out of balance. And what I really needed to get back to was, I was reading, who am I really? What kind of character am I really? And so, the relationship with my mother and I has always been amazing, but I began to truly appreciate what she had done for me in my life. And so that really, although we always got on well, my mother used to look at me sometimes and say, coming to see me a lot more these days, and I think there's so many things, but obviously we're already, 20 minutes into this, so we won't make this too long for everyone, but I'm sure you're not bored. The biggest thing that practicing and being a practitioner of Falun Gong has done for me in my life, in the way of just my world around me, is my son and my wife. Now, I know quite a few people in life, and I'm sure Loui does, and I'm sure you do too. And I'd say many of the people you know are either having relationship troubles or they're divorced. And married again, divorced again, married again, divorced again. I know my own mother, she's on her second marriage. And I think many of my friends actually, I know many of my friends, it's a part of the world that is breaking. Our marriages are breaking all the time, and our relationships with people are very tough. Our families. And so what happened for me is I met a young lady that I used to teach nutrition and fitness to in a deportment agency that I worked in. About 3 years later, she started to do some modeling, and a friend of hers told her about this personal trainer who was really helping her to get the physical achievements that she wanted. That happened to be me. And she said, oh my gosh. She said, Michael, you were teaching me years ago. I'm like, wow, that's great. So anyway, I trained Angela for a year. She went on to bigger and better things. And 3 years later, she called me out of the blue. Now, I'd been practicing Falun Gong by that point for 3 years, and I had changed a lot. I'd gone from, how wide is this screen? I don't think my shoulders or my head would have fitted on this screen at that time. So I was huge when Ange had, gone. I think she went to Melbourne to go sort of step up in modeling or whatever. And she rung me out of the blue. Loui, a little bit like what you were saying, she was going through some really tough times, really tough, but she was also living a fairly tough life, a model's life, that was getting a little bit out of hand, I think. And I asked her during the conversation, whatever happened to you? Where did you go? She said, I moved to Melbourne. It just happened to be that I'd quit my job and I was moving to Melbourne in a week. So, of course, I met her there, and the rest is history. Now, Ange started practicing Falun Gong when we were courting each other. And she had some beautiful things. For any of the ladies watching, wow, I've never seen a woman glow so strongly as when she first started to attain the Fa. And as we progressed to the point of getting married, I can tell you, just like any other relationship, there was hell and high water to when we first got married. It was like, whoa, all the karma in the world. Like many of you will have experienced that. When you actually do something so beautiful as to get married, sometimes it's followed by quite a lot of trials and tribulations between each other. But what really saw us through so beautifully was we were both studying Zhuan Falun. So literally, after every time one of us exploded at each other, and, nothing terrible, of course, we would reflect inwards, which is exactly what teacher Li Hongzhi teaches, is this looking within. And I'd just go back and apologize that it'd all be over, and, and this only went on for a short period of time. I can tell you, after 17 years of marriage, my wife and I are still like teenagers together. My son, who's 17 years old, he is this beautiful splice between a noble warrior, because he's ever since he was 11, he's learned karate, Wing Chun. Now he's in MMA, for crying out loud. He's like this splice between this noble warrior and an incredibly kind person. And he was reading Zhuan Falun from the age of 5. I couldn't be prouder of him. Could not be prouder. But to be honest, even if he wasn't quite that, I'd still be proud. And the teaching has taught me what it is to stumble as a father. You become a father, you have no idea how difficult it is. You've got no idea at all how difficult it is to deal with a wife, a growing son as a toddler, and then a child, and then what he is now, which is a teenager, an older teenager. But every time I would stumble and I'd lose my patience, I'd get angry. Let's just say I'd get angry, seriously angry. Again, all I would hear is Zhuan Falun in the back of my head, and I would look within, and I literally would just rectify it. It was incredible. And it's all because I read Zhuan Falun every day, probably like Loui does. To me, it guides now how I take care of things with everyone. And it's beautiful, whether it be my employees at work, whether it be my son, my wife, Loui, the next guy, the stranger in the street. And the difference, the spiritual progression I've made with it has just been like, oh my goodness, that'll have to be for another episode, I think, because oh my gosh, I've had 21 years of practicing this thing. So I actually realize now that when I lived in Hong Kong, again, that's for another episode, I actually had things happening with me that were part of the practice of Falun Gong, but I hadn't even heard of Falun Gong. It was going to be 2 solid years before I even came into contact with it. But I know now, after 21 years, that the things that were happening to me in the past, these kind of destiny related things. And I'm sure Loui has felt different things like that as well. So look, everyone, we've poured our hearts out to you. And I hope you can see, especially from those beautiful eyes of Loui, we're just two blokes. We're just two Aussies. We've been practicing Falun Gong for a period of time. We've had so many things go on, so many good things. We've had tough times, just like Falun Gong. Practicing this beautiful thing is not always easy. It can be seriously tough when you don't want to lose something that you think, this makes me feel like I'm winning something. But we've spent this episode just wanting to give you a very, very tiny insight into the massive things that this beautiful practice has done for us. So we'll say good night, Loui. Good night, my friend.
Good night. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing, Mike.
Yeah, no, thank you. And like I said, I hope you can all tell there's no script in this. If this were a script, this would be the most rehearsed script on earth. So good night. See you later.